And that's the, am I right that that's the subject of the graphic novel that you're working
Yeah,
on?
exactly. Yeah, right. Yeah, and in some ways it's like a creative nonfiction book, but it's a graphic book. And basically telling this story about the history of convict leasing in Kentucky. And I'm kind of letting Frederick Douglass and Ida B. Wells be the kind of narrators of the story because they had this conflict, because they both wrote about convict leasing, first of all, but they also had this conflict around the Chicago World's Fair in the 1890s, where they initially agreed to boycott it because there was such a poor African American representation in the Chicago World's Fair. But then Frederick Douglass was invited to speak by the Haitian delegation because he had formerly been an ambassador. And Ida B. Wells was upset that after agreeing to boycott it, that he would go ahead and participate in it. And they later patched it up. And Ida B. Wells wound up editing this book called The Reason Why the Colored American is Not at the Chicago World Exposition. And Frederick Douglass contributed to it. And so I'm kind of using that story of their feud and then also their work on convict leasing to tell the story of this prison in Kentucky where it has this history of sort of pioneering convict leasing several decades before the 13th Amendment, which is why the book's called Before 13th. But, I think what it reveals is that although after emancipation, convict leasing would essentially be a way to keep African Americans in a condition analogous to slavery, that's not when it started or why it started. And I guess when I think about the two sort of projects we've been discussing side by side, like the work I've been doing on life insurance and the work on convict leasing, it feels like my argument is essentially that that the history of insurance reveals that even people who were enslaved could be highly skilled and could have sometimes a lifestyle approximating like a highly exploited wage worker. And then the convict leasing work, it's like even someone who's a free citizen could be exploited and have a lifestyle approximating that or approaching that of an enslaved person. And it's as if like highly skilled enslaved people and highly exploited free white people, there's a kind of continuum there where you could be on either side of the continuum and there's even a porous boundary between them. Like some historians have shown that like in places like Maryland in the last few decades of legalized slavery, if an enslaved person escaped and they were managing a household, like as a maid, they might just hire like a newly arrived European immigrant and pay them very little. So almost like a very skilled slave that they pay nothing and a not quite as skilled European immigrant who they pay very little was almost interchangeable for some of these households, So I think that's a very interesting story about kind of the porous boundaries around race and skill and value.